warmed up. Ow, hot handle. Which is why I can't stop talking. What was I saying? Oh yeah, it's August. Bleh. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Today we're going to be doing another simple little urban sketching tutorial, which is ideal for beginners because it's going to be simple zones, and then we're going to go in and put in some lovely loose watercolour, mixing those paints on the paper as we go. Now, one of the great things about urban sketching is it's a fast process, and today I'm going to be showing you how we build up layers quickly, and how we can build up textures in foliage and things like that. So if you're new to urban sketching, or you're an artist who just wants to learn some simple techniques for filling a sketchbook full of beautiful little pieces of art, well, join me and have a sketch along. Now, if you'd like to download the reference image so that you can have it on a second screen while you're sketching along with me, there's a link in the description below, and that will take you to my website where you can download the image. So let's get started. So if we look at the reference drawing, it's basically quite simple to break it down into some different territories or different zones. Primarily we have the church, that's actually Salisbury Cathedral, beautiful building, in the very, very far background. And then in the middle ground we have the fields between the cathedral and the foreground is very much the trees. Now, the reason why I've chosen that to be the foreground is because it's the darkest element, so it's kind of in silhouette, and it means we can tell a story quite simply by having foreground, midground and background. Now, obviously, in life, there is many variations in that, and there's going to be infinite degrees between one and the other, but in this case, we can keep it quite simple and just go for 3. So if you want to do a really detailed version of this drawing, then obviously you can download the reference image and you could go mad. So primarily the line work is going to be used for the foreground, so the fence, the grass, the riverbank and the foliage that frames the picture on either side. And then I'm also going to use some really simple line work for that tree in the centre and the horizontal line near there. The cathedral in the far background is going to be done with just watercolour. Now, the reason I'm doing that is because if I drew a line around the outside, I think it would kind of lose that wonderful ghostly diaphanous feel. You can have that word, it's one of my favourite words. It's onomatopoeic. In other words, it sounds like it is. There's another one that's a really lovely word, is mellifluous, which means flowing like honey. I sound like it, right? Anyway, I like language and I like words, and okay, which is why I can't stop talking. What was I saying? Oh yeah, so I don't want to use a line around the cathedral in the background because it'll kind of break the fourth wall, as it were, and you'll lose that softness. I just need to crack on. I need to start and stop chatting. So for this drawing, I'm going to be using my trusty little Kaweco Sport pen. Cheap, cheerful, and pretty reliable, I've found. Okay, so the water is going to be about a third of the way up, so I'm going to put in just a few dots there. I'm going to slightly, maybe a bit further up there, and then the tree, the fence posts, those 3 fence posts in the middle. And then I know I'm going to put in just a few dots for some of this foliage because I think it's going to be vaguely there. And then we've got this one coming out there. And then the tree in the centre and the trunk. So I'm not drawing any lines in, as I say, for the cathedral. I'm just going to do that in watercolour. So really now, the main thing is just to sketch in this foreground, so I can start there and I'm going to draw some, never miss an opportunity to add in some texture. So I'm going to add in some nettles and whatever these bushes are here. And again, there's some spiky beasts here, and that fence post. And then there's a big bush here. So I'll do that as a kind of mixture of dots, and then this disappears into here where it's dark. So there's a wire fence across here, but so, you know, it's my picture, I can change what I want. I'm going to just do a sort of a single stretch of barbed wire because it's just an interesting texture. So I can do that by going drag, stop, drag, stop, drag, stop, drag, stop, like that. Drag, stop, drag, stop. And then just putting some dots on. The reason why I'm choosing to just do a stretch of barbed wire as opposed to a sort of mesh is because it's simple and it adds a little bit of interesting texture. Okay, so then about another halfway up from there we have this background detail. Here you see I've moved that tree already, really. And then we've got a tree. And then that is a particularly stringy beast. Now I'm just using the pen very lightly here. And just trying to be a little bit expressive there. So that's that done. So really here in the foreground we have quite a few different bits and bobs going on. Now I can't strictly see what's going on in that dark area along the riverbank because it's actually black in this image. It's going to be quite dark when I paint it, but it might not be completely that dark. So instead of just drawing a straight line in to denote the bottom of the riverbank, I'm going to add some texture. So if it's a tiny bit light, it still reads as an organic area and not just a straight line, an arbitrary straight line across your painting. Because as we know, riverbanks don't tend to be, unless they are, you know, an artificial riverbank, they don't tend to have those straight lines in them. And again, add in just a couple of bushes for the sake of that fill texture. Okay, so now is the complicated bit really, is we're going to start adding in these trees on the right and left hand side. Now you can simplify these quite a lot. You could just do them as circles effectively with some sort of cutouts in them, but I still want to try and show that they are foliage. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to scale it up a bit so that the leaves are slightly bigger, not too big, and I'm going to leave some areas of cutouts that suggest gaps through the tree. So as I said before, you know, foliage is a very personal thing, how you draw leaves and things, but it's always great to practice. You could just sit and doodle for 5 minutes a day, just try different leaf shapes and different densities of foliage and just have a play with it really. So I know that the tree comes all the way down to here. So I'm thinking about some of these as solid shapes, like a solid outline, but then out of that we have the odd branch with some foliage on, and it's these little branches that come out which actually tell us what this whole mass is actually made of, if that makes sense. So say for example if you leave a gap there and then you just put those details in there, you don't have to do every tree. You really don't have to draw every tree, every leaf. So we'll do something like that. You can even draw some leaves just by themselves, just in the middle of the area. Now I know this is a little bit of a sort of caricature or quite a cartoony way of drawing, but it's a style I enjoy. but also I think it's a really good place to simplify a drawing. If you can simplify a drawing down to its sort of constituent parts, then really it's up to you how complicated and how protracted you want to be in terms of adding details. So some of these bits as we get further up are just simple, a couple of leaves sticking out on a branch. I mean, obviously I'm looking at the reference drawing, but I'm not following it slavishly. What I'm doing is I'm looking for inspiration almost. I'm saying, oh, I can see those sort of shapes in this bit, and then there's a line at the top, and you can see sort of by the cathedral there's that bit sticking out there. And then there's a sort of big bit on the top there that with a leaf there and a leaf there. The other thing you can do is you can just go and draw some leaves by themselves. They don't have to be attached to anything. Just draw a couple by themselves like that, and that helps break up that that solid shape. If you just paint a couple of individual trees just floating in individual leaves floating in space, yeah, it can just break up that shape a little bit. So say, for example, if you leave another gap there and just put a couple of leaves in it like that, that's quite nice. And again, you can just draw almost like a little bunch or a little hand of leaves there and there. Again, leave a gap. And then I think what we'll do is we'll come back in this side. Now the reason why it's not important to cover the whole of this area is because you're going to be covering it in paint. So painting is almost like the second layer almost. So you've got two instruments playing, if you know what I mean. So if you've got music and you've got two instruments playing, sometimes those instruments will work together, and you'll have like a superposition is the wrong, like a syncopation, where those two instruments will play the same thing, and that can really be powerful. But often those instruments might want to play different tones, so that their jobs are slightly different within a piece. And it's a bit like this with art in a way, is the watercolour can do something completely different to the line work, and that's really fun, but it has to almost be completely different, if you know what I mean. Or it can be very, very sympathetic to the line work. So what we're doing here is half the lifting is being done by the line work, and then the other half is actually being done by the watercolour. Okay, so we've probably done enough for that side, really. I don't want to do too much. Now, the tree on the left-hand side, I would say the tree on the right is a tree. The tree on the left is definitely another tree, but it's got a slightly different leaf on it. The leaves look longer and thinner. It could be an ash. I don't really know. But it's just another opportunity to create a bit of texture. So with this one, I'm going to do it as more long branches with little trees, little leaves. I keep having a problem with that word. With the little leaves hanging off them, basically. So we'll start down here. Leaves like this. Now you can see from the way that I'm approaching this one, it's a slightly different shape. In other words, it's not like these small triangular leaves. What I'm doing is I'm using a longer branch and then doing much longer leaves. Now, the technique that I'm using here again is this sort of slightly continuous line type technique. And this is something that I've developed over time and practice. I've talked a little bit before about foliage and about actually there's nothing like going out there and just practicing again and again and again. But there's also very different ways you can approach foliage. What I'm very much doing here is I am drawing the the actual parts of the tree, you know, the material fabric of the tree, but you don't even have to do that. You could just draw the shadows. You don't have to actually draw the terrain and then sort of colour it in, if you know what I mean. There are so many different ways you can do it. You can just add a blob of ink or watercolour and then add different values of watercolour in a wet way, or build it up in dry it and build it up in glazes. That's another really fun way of doing foliage. One technique that works really well that I've used in the past, which I will return to in a tutorial at some time, is you create quite a flat wash, quite a wet wash, and then you use a credit card and let it dry for a little bit, and then use a credit card or a plastic scraper or a knife, and you scratch in some white, so it scratches the paint off the page, and you get these lovely crisp white highlights. That's a really fun one. Anyway, less chatting, more drawing. So I'm just going to concentrate on some of these nice little end details that are here. And again, because some of this is going to be quite dark in here, I don't need to do every single little bit. And again, I can just do almost some leaves on their own. Okay, so we've got another branch coming up here. One of the nice things about drawing foliage is it can be one of the most relaxing things you can do, really. If you get in a zone, you get in a flow state, it can be really lovely just sketching a tree, or you know, something in the foreground like a bramble. There we go. So I've got those two trees in. They are slightly different styles, as you can see. We have a more solid, chunky style, and then this one is a lot more soft. But again, as we start laying in the watercolour for those, we can add paint accordingly. Now the foreground is a bit of a tricky one. You know, like in the boat demonstration I was doing earlier, where I had the main contrast of the image really was on the water or in and around the boat, and that's what brings you into the foreground, and then your eye will journey through the picture, if you know what I mean. Well, I'm kind of going to do the same there, but I think that foreground texture in terms of that brightness and on the water, I'm going to do that with watercolour, with a dry brush technique. And add in those shadows up the side, probably about the same time as I add in the trees. So we can get cracked on with that. Now with this one, is what do you paint first? Well, personally, I think the first thing to do is to assume that the sky, because we're doing 3 layers, remember? So we've got zone 1, 2 and 3. So we're going to assume that the sky is not going to be painted. I mean, you could put a dusting in there, but so the first thing I want to do is start with the lightest tone. So I'm going to go in and actually draw in the cathedral with watercolour. So that should be a fun one. So the first question then is, what colour should that be? That's a good question. So even the simplest of watercolours drawings can involve a little bit of layering. So there's going to be a few breaks in this where we go off and we hair dry this and just dry it so that we can get some crisp lines. Otherwise, if it all gets wet, it all merges together and it ends up in a little bit of a mess, which is fine if that's what you're after. But in this case, we're we're not trying to do that. So what I decided to do on this one is do some very, very gentle sky details. So I'm going to just do a tiny, tiny bit of blue, and I'm going to put a spot of blue in the water as well. So how I'm going to do that is I'm going to take some water, clean water, and I'm just going to lay that right over the top there, quite quick, and I'm going to do the same on the water down here. And then I'm going to get some blue. I'm using French ultramarine here, but just a very, very dilute amount on there, and I'm going to just lay in a tiny bit of blue here, maybe just a, as you can see, I'm just using some stuff that was on my palette already, some blue there. I'm not being too precious, so we'll do something like that, and then a line down there, and then the same in the, just some quite abstract shapes there in the water. So I hope you can see we've done that in the sky and that in the water. And the reason why we've done it in both is because I want it to really read as a reflection. So if those were just white and white, you wouldn't quite have got that cue, that sort of visual cue that this is a reflection, the water is actually a reflective surface. Maybe it's superfluous, I don't know. So that's the first layer of very, very far background, zone 4 I guess, or zone 5 in this case. So I'm going to hairdry that really quickly, and then we're going to get on with the cathedral. A little tip for hairdrying paintings, pictures, I'll just shut that, is you can use the hairdryer in the front and make sure there's no drips, there's no wetness, and then on a clean surface you can turn it over and hairdry the back. And that way you'll stop it turning into a banana, and then do a little bit on the back and then flip it over, do a final bit on the front, and if it's still bent like a banana, turn it back and do a bit on the back. Some processes it needs to be bone dry. Say for example if you're going to go in with fountain pen or marker or something, you don't want it to bleed into any wet space, but normally with watercolour it doesn't have to be completely dry. But you kind of get that from experience, really. Anyway, so we're going to go and paint this cathedral in. So this is, in some ways, perhaps the most technical part of the drawing. We've got a very pointy tower. Now, this is one of those times when you really want it to be symmetrical and really pointy and really perfect, but it doesn't matter if it doesn't go that way. It doesn't really matter. This is the process that we're enjoying here, and this is how we're learning. We're really not bothered about it looking perfectly symmetrical or anything like that, so do feel free to be a bit expressive, be loose, you know. Okay, so I'm going to draw that in now. So what colour? Well, I'm going to go for, I'm going to mix a little bit of French ultramarine here with a bit of, maybe a bit of Van Dyke brown here, or sort of burnt umber would do the same thing. I'm going to make a grey, and I might add a little bit to that, but before I do that, because I want this cathedral to fade as it goes down, so that you get this sense of mist, this morning mist in the meadow below, I'm going to actually paint the cathedral in with water first. Now there's two advantages in doing this. It means that you get a lovely gradient because you're working wet in wet, but it also means that you can see where the water is, so if it's not quite right, what you can do then is you can dry it off and do it again. So we have a vertical line there, and then cathedral sort of comes down that sort of shape. And I'll put in some pointy bits. I'm using quite a thin brush for this. There, and then there's a line there, and then another bit there, and then that disappears down here. And I'm just going to drag that water down there, and then we've got a roof along there, so I want this to be a little bit sort of wet in wet, and we've got some of the details which we can put in when we add some paint. So I've got this grey that I mixed before. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to drop that in. You don't have to paint it in because the water will push it about. So I'm going to just drop that in, thus. Might make it a tiny bit darker. There we go. Particularly in the top. Because I'm actually dropping pigment into what is a wet area, I don't actually have to, you know, paint every bit of it. I'm just going to put a point on there. And if you were using ink, you could literally just drop a bit in it, it'd go and go everywhere. But we're not using ink today. So I'm just going to do something like that, and then here we're going to add a little sort of detail bit, and then I want to put in a bit of a curve there to try and show that there's sort of mist in the field here. Okay, so the one thing I want to do is I want to make the top of the spire a little bit darker so that it's got a bit more of a gradient. So again, I'll add a little bit more pigment to this little mix, and I'll start at the top and then sort of work my way down. There we go. Now you can see the reference drawing, there is some, there's actually some holes in that tower, which might be quite fun to add in, but I'm not going to do that today. Some white bits, and there's obviously a bit of a cross at the top, like a lot of cathedrals. That's not very straight, but doesn't matter. Right, okay, so I think that's probably fine for that. Now again, with watercolour, you know that if it goes on a little bit dark, when it dries, it'll be lighter. So don't be afraid about going a little bit too much, and then as it dries, it'll go lighter. And if it is ultimately too dark, you can always re-wet it and lift off by adding tissue paper, by dabbing it with tissue. So we're going to dry that, and then the fun starts, because we're going to start doing the foliage. We're going to start with the foliage, so we're going to start producing some greens and different tones. Looking at the reference image, the lightest bit is the sort of field and the top of the tree, really. So we're going to start by mixing up a nice light pale green. So I'm going to take a sap green here. Well, you can see, maybe move this along a bit so then you can see what I'm doing. So I'm going to take a sap green and I'm going to just add it in here where this little bit of blue was. And again, a little bit more. This is Daniel Smith sap green. Add a little blue to it. Maybe a tiny bit of this reddy orange just to mute it down a bit. And we'll start with that. So this has been hair dried. So I'm going to add in this is a small mop brush I'm using here. These are very, very good brushes. I've had it a while. It's falling apart, as a lot of brushes are if you use them a lot. And then I'm going to just run that along there with a sort of the dry brush technique again. So that's a first layer of green on there. Now I quite like that, but what I want to do is I'm just going to make that a solid green. I'm going to do a little bit on that tree. So I'm going to take a bit of this Van Dyke brown, you know, I've mixed in this grey here, and I'm going to add a little bit more in there. And I might take a little bit of this quinacridone rose, add a bit of that, and then back to the sap green. I'll mix a bit of a stronger colour of that. Now this sort of painting is, you know, with a lot of painting, is it comes with, I don't actually want to dictate what you paint, what colours you choose and things like that, because I think you learn a lot from just experimenting. But I do want you to be a little bit fearless with the way you try stuff, and don't be afraid to just have a go. And we might go back in and add the trunk in when that's a bit drier. So because I don't mind to a certain extent this being quite simple, that mid-ground, because I don't want it to have too much contrast, too much detail in. I might leave that there. I might go in and put a little bit of shadow under the tree and actually a little bit of the tree trunk in, because that's a tiny bit darker. So we're going to hairdry this again. I know it's expensive, isn't it, all this electricity? And then we're going to go and get some really big, bold, wet, dark colours mixed for this amazing foreground. So for this foreground, we're going to have to mix quite a lot, because there's quite a lot of paint to go on there, and it is actually pretty dark. Now, I might be tempted to almost do the water separately in this case, because I think it will just make it a little bit less intimidating than doing it all as one. So we're going to just concentrate on all that dark foliage. So I'm going to go and mix here a dark grey. So I guess you could use a sort of Payne's grey, or depending on what you have. I'm going to use a bit of French ultramarine here, and I'm going to add in a little bit of Van Dyke brown to mix myself up a grey. Now, because there's a lot of foliage in here, I'm also going to add a tiny bit of green to that. Now, again, it's a personal thing. I want to make sure I have enough mixed. There we go. So I'm not quite sure how dark that is yet. So what I'll do is I'll try a bit on a different bit of paper, and I'll have a think about that. Yeah, that looks pretty good. So instead of testing it on the piece, we test it on a bit of spare paper. It's always nice to have some spare paper handy, as well as some tissue. So I'm going to go in and I'm going to start painting some of this this foliage in. Now, your brush size will often dictate the size of the foliage. But I'm using this mop brush here. I'm just going to do some little dots. Not be too precious about it. You can still do some quite small details with even a big brush if it is natural fibre, because it'll come to actually no, some synthetic fibres will come to a nice pointy end as well. So I'm starting with a few of these little dots here, and I'm going to add in a few more of those and build up a bit more of a sort of density. And then when I get a bit more into the middle of the tree, I'll add in some, there you go, add in some dots. So you can see why I've mixed up a lot of colour here, is because I want to try and keep this a little bit wet. And because of that, sometimes it's nice to work quite quickly, because obviously if you get too dry, you end up with crisp lines, which at this stage is probably not what we're trying to achieve. What we're trying to achieve here is a sort of layer one of dark foliage. So I'll take a bit of that green and I'll just add in as we go, I'll add in some slightly different mixtures here. Because if it's just one colour, it can look a little bit flat and a little bit wrong in a weird way. So then we're going to go across the bottom and then start on that tree and work down. Okay, so a little bit more green there. Don't forget those posts. Again, don't be too precious. You don't have to. It doesn't have to be absolutely perfect. And as you're painting, it's maybe the opportunity to add in a little bit more detail there. Let's just zoom in so you can see what I'm doing. So I'm just adding in a little bit more detail. Now I'm going to go and add in that trunk there, and I'm going to also add in a little bit of shadow under there and just under there. And using the same colour as the foreground, it gives it some a sort of slightly cohesive feel. So again, I'm doing some of these details. I'm not being too fussed about this side. We can just knock some of that in there. And then again with the grey. You can see that there is a bit of a natural shape to this brush where it'll, if you spin it round, it will do different sort of leaves like that. Am I at the wrong bit here? The other thing as well is, you really don't have to paint every leaf, or you could do extra leaves. You could leave some of the leaves here completely white. There isn't any hard and fast rules here. You can make it up as you go along. That's all I do. Now, despite my best efforts, it looks like I'm slightly running out of watercolour here. So we'll mix a tiny bit of that more. Quickly those three colours again. It doesn't have to be exactly the same tone. I'm not bothered by that. As long as the main pigment, the dark pigment is, I'm going to add a little bit more down here. The main dark bits of these corners. Now, it's not so important to keep a wet edge when you're doing this, because the whole point of it is as it gets towards the edge, it gets a little bit more broken up. There you go. You can keep this as loose and as sort of impressionistic as you want, really. Right, so that's that. So we're going to go in again and add a little bit more of this pigment, darkness. We're getting there. So I'm going to hair dry that now so we can do some final bits in the foliage, and then we're going to mix up some really dark grey, and we're going to do that light reflection. We're going to do that sparkly reflection in the water. So one more hair dry, probably two more hair dry, but 3, 4. This last bit of foliage to do on either side. So I'm going to add in a little bit more green to a little bit more blue. And then I'm going to just add in some more texture down here. Now you might say, well, why are you doing that? Because, well, the reason why I'm doing that is I don't want this to be just one amorphous shape. I want it to be a tiny bit broken up, and I also want this dark space down here to be a dark shadow type area. I'm going to add a little bit more in there. A bit of Van Dyke Brown, and then I'm going to do the same here. So I'm going to just try and sort of highlight some more shadow type areas. Again, I don't want to be too fussy. There we go. It's always nice to, on some of the more organic textures, within a watercolour, to have a couple of different glazes, a couple of different layers of watercolour, because organic shapes rarely are simple flat colours. Right, so finally we're going to do the water. Now the water, the reflection on the water is all across, it's kind of across the bottom of the image, so the riverbank is slightly reflected, but then it's dry brush with the centre being lighter, so you're dry brushing from one side to the other. So what I'm going to do is, again, I'm going to try and mix up, I'm going to clean that bit of the palette because I don't want any green in there. There we go. So I'm going to mix up some grey. So again, for that I'm going to use my Van Dyke, and I'm not going to use much water. There you go. So that's quite a rich mixture, and this is the bit of the image, this is the bit of the painting that it's, you kind of got to be a bit bold and just go for it, because to a certain extent it has to be sort of gestural, it has to be like a whoosh. If you go too slow and if you're too thoughtful, it couldn't look ideal. But we have an advantage that we can practice, so sometimes it's useful to dry your brush off a little bit and go with a very, oh, that's quite nice, a very wet brush. So we'll start there. So as you can see from the reference image, it's quite dark here, but it gets lighter as we get to the centre. So what I can do is I can start on this edge. There's a bit of varnish that's come off my brush. Very annoying. Okay. So I know it's actually quite dark in this bit. So that's that side. Now I'm going to add a little bit more, and I'm going to do the same from that side. Using textured paper for this makes a hell of a difference. There we go. So with the last bit here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to just put this shadow in under the reflection in under this riverbank. Now if you look at the reference drawing, there is some small little reflections running along there. Little lines, so you can add them in. That was a bit of a Bob Ross moment. Those little lines, just let them play. Just have fun. Sounds a bit weird. Makes me sound a bit creepy. Right, so we'll do that. Now it's important to look into the image and see where it is completely black almost. And that is basically around these edges. So this down here, you can go in and really add in some darkness there just because of that lovely contrast. Okay. Now that we're far off there, what I might do is hairdry that, and then I've noticed I've got a bit of a lot of paint. Hairdry that and then just a couple of white highlights, and I think we're done. It's looking nice though. So the last couple of touches I'm going to do on this one are just going to be some tiny highlights in the water. So we're going to go in and just put in some nice blobs. There's a couple here. Sometimes you get a little row. Sort of 2 or 3. It's just to sort of add a bit of interest, really. There we go. So I think that's it. I'm quite happy with that. Obviously the tower is a bit wonky. Don't really care about that. It's been a really fun exercise. Let's have a bit of a close-up on some of the elements. Okay. So yeah, you can see slightly wonky tower. Some of these leaves are really nice. As you can see, I've not painted every one. There's a couple of layers on there which give a sort of slight sense of of texture. And then this fence across the front, and then this dry brush technique for the water. So there you go. So there we go, this nice little A5 piece. So I do hope you enjoyed that. There's plenty more content here on the channel. There's going to be plenty more coming up, so please give me a like and subscribe. That really helps the channel. It costs you nothing. It's all baby steps on the road to me ultimately creating my evil art empire, which is my one true vision. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed that, and we'll see you next time. Thank you. Bye-bye.